Let's talk about running backs that you should start or sit heading into week 14, a crucial week for a lot of us. It's the last week before the fantasy playoffs, and there is another bye-mageddon. Why does the NFL do this? Week 14, I don't understand. You will have the Ravens, Broncos, Texans, Colts, Patriots, and Commanders all on bye. So no Derrick Henry, Javonte Williams, Joe Mixon, Jonathan Taylor, Ramondre Stevenson, or Brian Robinson. But don't worry, in today's video, I'm going to help you set those lineups. We'll go through every matchup. There are 13 matchups, 26 teams in play. Starting off with Thursday Night Football, Packers at Lions. And I know Thanksgiving was last week, but this almost feels like a Thanksgiving game. Obviously in division, both teams with great records. Both teams technically still in the fight for the divisional title. 51.5 point over-under, which is the highest over-under of the week. So we should get a lot of fantasy points straight off the bat from Thursday Night Football. The Lions are favored by 3.5 points, but it's a close spread. Josh Jacobs, of course you're going to start Josh Jacobs. He now has, in his last 6 games, 5 out of those 6 games have gone for over 20 PPR points. He's getting touchdowns now. He is everything that you drafted him to be in a good offense. They're kind of building the entire offense around him at the right time. It is a tough matchup against the Lions, so maybe lower your expectations. Maybe this is a matchup where, he gets 15 points instead of over 20, but definitely still going to be in your starting lineups. On the opposite side of the ball, as we've been saying all year, you're going to start both Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. Jahmyr Gibbs didn't have the best game last game, but we know these guys sometimes one shines, the next week the other shines, but both are absolute must starts each and every week. It was a little funny story going around this week where Jahmyr Gibbs apparently accidentally leaked some of the plays that they run through social media. So we'll see if there's any discipline. I doubt there is. I think it's more just a funny story. But it is funny regardless. All right, moving on. Let's go to the Sunday 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slate of games. Jets at Dolphins. Right? 2 teams that before the season were projected to be serious playoff contenders. Well, the Dolphins aren't eliminated technically yet, but the Jets are awful. 45.5 point over under. The Dolphins are favored by almost an entire touchdown. Look, I know Breece Hall was pretty bad last week. I get it. You might not want to put him out there, but with all of the injuries and all the buys that are happening here in week 14, I'm absolutely going to continue to label him a must start. Last week he had just 13 touches compared to 7 for Braylon Allen. So his injury report is something that we're going to have to monitor throughout the week. But assuming he gets a couple limited participation practices in and then gets a full towards the end of the week, he's going to be a locked and loaded must go. And this could be a bounce back game versus the Dolphins, who are a top 12 matchup for your fantasy running back. And overall, Breece versus Braylon Allen, it's still very much Breece's backfield, but I do get people's concerns. Let's move on to the Dolphins here with Devon Achane. Man, if you look at Devon Achane's box score in the past 2 weeks, he is getting barely any rushing yards. The efficiency is way down. It's super strange considering the Dolphins offense and how good they've been on the ground for the past couple of years, but he is being absolutely saved through the air. All right, he has 3 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. They are all receiving touchdowns, all right, averaging around I think it's around almost 7 targets per game in that span too. So in PPR formats, he's very safe. Even in traditional standard formats, because of the work he gets through the air and the touchdowns that he sees, he's still a safe option as well. All right, the third matchup we'll look at here is the Falcons at the Vikings. Very excited about this one. Obviously, Kirk Cousins comes back to Minnesota. I'm sure that will be the biggest storyline of the week. 46.5 point over under. The Vikings are favored by 4.5 points. So, on the Falcons side of the ball, Bijan Robinson, one of the best running backs in fantasy football. Fresh off the bye week last week, puts up 25 points, has over 100 rushing yards, 6 targets, catches all of them. He's been an absolute superstar, one of the best running backs in fantasy football since week 6 onwards. He's a top 3 running back, and there's no way you're going to bench this guy, even though it is a tough matchup, right? I mean, last week we talked about James Conner. Look, these guys who just get all the work, you can't bench them, especially when you have a superstar like Bijan Robinson. On the opposite side of the ball, I'm not going to lie, I am a little scared about Aaron Jones. It's not so much the matchup, it's just last week he only had 9 touches. He did fumble the ball as well twice, and they did bench him for a period of time. Now, I don't think that they can afford to do that. He is clearly their best running back. Cam Akers he's just not the same level of talent. So I do think he's still a reliable name to put out there, but maybe lower your expectations for Aaron Jones each and every week moving forward. Fourth matchup we'll look at here is the Saints at the Giants. This is a 40.5 point over-under, which is the second lowest over-under of the week. But the good news for this matchup is we have two running backs who are very clearly, the guy in their backfield, and you can start them. They've been reliable in fantasy football this year. Alvin Kamara, my RB5 on the week. Now, here's what I will say about the Saints. If Kendre Miller's out there and you have a spare spot, maybe you're in a dynasty league or whatever the case may be, he's worth stashing at this point. This coaching staff definitely loves him. He's coming back from IR, and it'll be interesting to see what sort of role he has moving forward. And I do think he is a good handcuff as well. If you own Alvin Kamara, you got to get your handcuffs right now. Giants are top 12 play for running backs, so definitely in play Alvin Kamara. On the opposite side of the ball, Tyrone Tracy, there was a little bit concern with his fumble issues that his role might be scaled back, but that wasn't the case at all. Thanksgiving Day versus the Dallas Cowboys in week 13, he had 73% of the snaps, and he had the most touches with 12, finished off with the touchdown, which was great to see. And now he has a great matchup versus Saints, who are the third best matchup for your running back when you adjust for schedule. We're starting him with a lot of confidence this week. I do think he's going to be a great, great name in fantasy football. The fifth matchup we'll look at is Panthers at Eagles, 45.5 point over under. The Eagles are favored and by almost 2 touchdowns. It's the largest spread of the week, 12.5 points. By far the biggest favorites, the biggest underdogs, the Carolina Panthers are. But the Panthers have been playing well against really good teams in the last couple weeks, right? Remember what they did versus the Kansas City Chiefs, and then they almost beat the Tampa Bay Bucks as well. So this is a competitive team at the moment with Bryce Young turning things around. Now, here's the bad news for Chuba Hubbard and Jonathan Brooks. This is one of the worst matchups in fantasy football over the last second half of the season, if you will. This is the third worst matchup for your running back right now. And again, if you only account for the second half of the season, it is the worst matchup. That entire defense in Philadelphia has completely turned it around, and it's in Philadelphia. I'm very concerned about this Panthers offense as a whole this week. I would be hesitant to rely on any names, but if you're going to start one name, it's Chuba Hubbard, and that's because you have so many buys and injuries that you're dealing with that he just has to go into your lineup. On the opposite side of the ball, Saquon Barkley, the best running back in fantasy football, has the best matchup in fantasy football. So I would personally be shocked if he doesn't put up over 20 PPR points as kind of a baseline. I think his expectations are skyrocketed high this week. All right, sixth matchup we'll look at here is the Browns at the Steelers. 41.5 point over under, the third lowest over under of the week. The Steelers are favored by a full touchdown pretty much. And here's the good news for Nick Chubb. All right, I'll play good cop, bad cop. The good news is the Steelers are a top 10 matchup for your fantasy running back. Great. The bad news is Nick Chubb is only on the field in neutral game scripts, and they don't really ever have neutral game scripts. They're constantly coming from behind, letting Jameis Winston kind of sling it all over the field. So, look, I've labeled Nick Chubb a spot start. The matchup is there. If you think they'll be in this game or up in this game, sure, you can put him out there. But I am personally not starting him unless I absolutely have to, just because Jerome Ford is out there more times than not instead of Nick Chubb when it is a negative game script. Now, as far as Najee Harris goes, he's just getting so much work. You got to put him into your lineups, right? Last week, he had 22 touches. The week before that, 18. The week before that, 23. 21 the week before. He's just constantly seeing over 20 touches. He's getting some targets through the air. It's a bad matchup against the Cleveland Browns. Thank God Javonte Williams got into the end zone because he would have had an absolute stinker as well. He pretty much did, even with the touchdown. But you can't start Najee Harris just because, he's getting so much volume. Jaylen Warren is a spot start. He's had 3 weeks in a row over 10 PPR points, and against tough matchups like Baltimore in week 11 and Cleveland in week 12. So you can still start Jaylen Warren, but again, kind of have that 10-point expectation, not, this sort of game-breaking week. The seventh matchup we'll look at here is the Raiders at the Bucks. 44.5 point over under. The Bucks are favored by 7 points. It's the second largest spread of the week. So the Bucks are definitely favorites in this game. Sincere McCormick is definitely a name to keep your eye on. Now, he did revert to the practice squad after their game on Sunday, but to me, that's more about game management, or not game management, rather team management, if you will. They got to figure out their numbers, all right? So it's more behind the scenes type of stuff. I do not see a scenario in which Sincere McCormick is not activated for Sunday. They talked about, this coaching staff talked about how they want to get him more involved, and he's earned that right. 2 weeks ago versus Denver, averages 6.5 yards per carry. Then last week versus Kansas City, a great defense, averages over 5 yards per carry, has 64 rushing yards. This is what the Raiders offense has been dreaming of. Are you kidding me? A competent running back on the ground, a guy that you can give 10 carries for and expect 50 yards in return, that is something that the Raiders haven't had this entire season. I fully anticipate him being their option, but he is a spot start. In fact, I would not start him. I would say 5% of people, maybe he's their best option. Those other 95%, you have a better name on your team already, but considering the fact that, he's made an impression and it's a middle of the pack matchup against the Bucs, you can put him out there. It's just not something that I would advise. Now, on the opposite side of this game, Bucky Irving has a monster game last week. And yes, we did have him on our nuclear video. He was one of our favorite plays last week. So I'm glad to see that pay off for you guys if you followed it or, did some parlays or whatever the case may be. He's going to continue to be a must start, a top 12 running back for me this week. That's right. Shout out to Rich over on Twitter, who says Bucky Irving has 256 yards rushing when contacted at or behind the line of scrimmage. Only Saquon Barkley has more this year. Irving has those yards on 40 fewer attempts than Barkley when hit at or behind the line of scrimmage. So pretty much like after contact, he is the best running back in the NFL right now. And that's awesome to see. We loved him coming out of Oregon, and he's slowly but surely kind of dominating this role. 25 carries last week, a career high. 28 total touches, a career high. I mean, the guy has just been absolutely dominant. And look, I'm still going to label Rachaad White a must start as well because he gets enough work through the air, enough goal line opportunities to garner kind of like this spot start status. And in this week, with so many people not available, I definitely think you can start him in a matchup against the Raiders, which is the 7th best matchup for your running back. All right, we will move on to the Jags at the Titans, the lowest over-under of the week, and I think rightfully so. The Jags offense is tough to watch. It's like watching paint dry. And the Titans offense, I mean, it can be fun depending on what type of Will Levis you see each and every week, but not a lot of points expected in this game. I don't feel comfortable starting any running back in Jacksonville. They're both healthy, but they both kind of steal each other's opportunities, and the offense isn't really flowing, so they don't have many goal line opportunities anyway. It's a damn shame because I think they're both talented running backs, but they're stuck in offenses that are just not even worth kind of, talking about at this point. On the opposite side of the ball, you can start Tony Pollard. In a more difficult matchup, let's say they were facing the Eagles, for example, I would probably tell you to sit Tony Pollard in a bad matchup. But the reality is this is a good matchup, the second best matchup for your running back. So I do think you can put Pollard out there with some relative confidence. Now, Tajay Spears did return from his concussion last week, and we did see more of a dominant kind of backfield for Tony Pollard for the first time since Tajay Spears came back. You can see weeks 10 to 11, it was very much a split backfield. Tajay was getting about 45% of the work, and Tony was getting about 55% of the work. But last week in week 13, Pollard had 14 touches compared to just 1 for Tajay Spears, and the snap share was way in favor of Tony Pollard. So that's a good sign. You've got a guy who you were worried about with touches splitting a backfield, but it's a great matchup. We saw just last week he dominated touches, so he should have a really good chance to go ahead and bounce back in this game versus the Jacksonville Jags. All right, moving on to the start of the 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slate of games. We've got 3 games in the afternoon slate. Seahawks at Cardinals, 44.5 point over under. This is the closest spread of the week. So if you think about it, the 49ers are kind of, fumbling the bag right now. But the Seahawks and Cardinals, this game is crucial for that division, the NFC West. So this should be a very, very fun game to watch. As far as the Seahawks go, we're going to continue to start Ken Walker. There has been a lot of disappointing performances pretty much since week 8. You've been relatively disappointed, but he's given you a safe floor for most of those games. But we know Ken Walker has a 20, 30-point game in him on any given week. The Cardinals are a decent matchup. Their 13th best matchup against running backs. So I'm going to continue to put Ken Walker out there into my lineups. And then as far as James Conner goes, last week he had a very tough matchup against the Vikings. Still managed to give you a good 11-point floor. Now he has a matchup against the Seahawks, which is much easier to run against. I definitely gonna put James Conner into my lineups with a lot of confidence this week. The 10th matchup we'll look at here is the Bills at the Rams. 49.5 over under, which is tied for the second highest over under of the week. So we should, keyword should, see a lot of fantasy points in this matchup. And there are two superstar running backs that you're starting, and that's the only guys we really are going to talk about, right? James Cook coming off an incredible game in the snow versus the 49ers, averaging over 7.5 yards per carry, 107 yards, just dominated in that snow game along with Ray Davis, who got a little more work because of the conditions. And then on the opposite side of the ball, Kyren Williams, now 2 weeks in a row getting into the end zone, which is where most of, kind of those big games in fantasy come from when he has those goal line opportunities. I will say Blake Corum is getting more and more work, which is a concerning trend heading into the fantasy playoffs. But this is a great matchup, the fourth best matchup for your running back. I think Kyren should have another great game. And if you're relying on him to get into the fantasy playoffs, this is your last week. I think he will do some big favors for you in this one. All right, 11th matchup we'll look at here. We've got Bears, 49ers. 44.5 over under. The 49ers are favored by 3.5 points. DeAndre Swift is a great play this week. A guy that we told you, hey, last week, don't love this guy as a start. Be very hesitant starting him. We were very unsure on, that game versus the Detroit Lions. But in this game in particular, I am going to tell you to start him with confidence. The 49ers are a top 8 matchup for your running back in fantasy football this week, or this year rather. Remember last week, James Cook and Ray Davis both went off against this defense. This defense is struggling with so many injuries. Actually, the entire team, the 49ers are a hospital right now. It is really, really rough. So DeAndre Swift, in good games, you can play him. In bad games, you don't want to put him into your lineup. And this is maybe the last good game on his schedule for the rest of the entire season. On the opposite side of the ball, according to David Lombardi, and it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, they have no one else, but Isaac Orendo will be the RB1 for this team with CMC and both Jordan Mason going on IR. And here's the good news for Isaac Orendo. If you're out there, I would suggest for him to be your number one waiver wire pickup. If you have any fab left and you're watching this and the waivers haven't cleared yet, spend whatever you have left to go out and get him. No, I can't promise you he'll be a league winner, but there is not going to be a running back like this available on the waiver wire again this entire season. A running back with clear opportunities on a good offense and a good rushing attack. It's just like, how many more times you're going to see this late into the season? Whatever fab I have left, I'm blowing it all for Isaac Orendo. And remember, in week 8 versus Dallas, that was his season high in carries with 14. He averaged over 6 yards per carry, had a touchdown, and over 19 fantasy points. So we have already seen him in this offense with a limited, opportunity. I'll give that to you. Be really, really good for fantasy football. But definitely a name that I'm going to start because the Bears are a top 5 matchup for your fantasy running back. And that offense is just chugging along, man. I mean, you might be able to put me at running back for the 49ers. I might be able to give you 15 fantasy points behind, that offense with that scheme that Shanahan's got going on there in the Bay. So I definitely think you can start him, especially with all the injuries going on in the buys. Moving on to Sunday Night Football, we've got Chargers at Chiefs, 42.5 over under. Chiefs are favored by about 3.5 points. It is in Kansas City, so keep that in mind. And, I don't think there's a clear start in this matchup. First off, both defenses are very good at stopping running backs. The Chiefs give up the fewest points in position. The Chargers are also bottom 3rd in the league matchup for your fantasy running back. I don't have really any confidence in Gus Edwards. The only reason he's even labeled a spot start is because of purely numbers based, right? You have so many impact running backs on bye and on who are injured, who are out of your rankings, that guys like Gus Edwards kind of move up your rankings, right? So RB28 on a normal week for Gus Edwards is more like RB38. And I just don't have much confidence in him. This team, unless they're in control of a game, they're not going to rely on him each and every week, right? He's been inconsistent. He's been up and down. He's been efficient and inefficient. And the only way Gus Edwards is a good play in fantasy football is if he gets a touchdown. If you predict that happening, great. Put him up there against the Kansas City Chiefs. But unless he gets a touchdown, you're going to absolutely regret it. And there's a chance that Kamani Vidal could have a larger role as we get, going into the season. I do think they will give him a chance to win this job at some point. I could be wrong. But, Gus Edwards he doesn't look that impressive. Why not see what you have with Kamani Vidal? So those 3 things alone are enough for me to sit Gus Edwards. On the opposite side of the ball, ideally you would start Isaiah Pacheco here. First game back, he had 37% of the snaps to 38% for Kareem Hunt. Pacheco looked much better than Kareem Hunt, averaged almost 6.5 yards per carry, 44 yards on 7 attempts. He looked explosive. He looked like his old self. So if you're going to start one of these names, it would be Pacheco, but it's not a good matchup to chase, and they could split opportunities. So be very cautious with Isaiah Pacheco this week. Last name we'll talk about here, our last matchup, Monday Night Football, Bengals at Cowboys. This is tied for the second highest over-under of the week. Should be a very good game. A lot of people will make the fantasy playoffs because of this matchup. That's so exciting to think about. The amount of people who are like, "Ooh, do I make the playoffs?" It'll all come down to Monday Night Football. So many, fantasy relevant names. And we'll start off with Chase Brown, my RB4. Yes, you are reading those rankings right. My RB4 on the week. Chase Brown without Zach Moss is averaging 18.5 PPR points per game. He's averaging well over 20 attempts with carries and targets and well over 120 yards per game. He is the definition of a league winner. And if you have him on your roster, congratulations, because he might be the reason you win your fantasy championship this year. On the opposite side of the ball, Rico Dowdle. Look, Rico Dowdle is a startable name. All right, he had a great matchup versus the Giants last week. Now, this is a more difficult matchup versus the Bengals. They actually give up the 5th fewest points to fantasy running backs right now, so be a little bit cautious. I know they just gave up Najee Harris, a bunch of points, but that offense is much more balanced. At least Cooper Rush is extending drives and getting them down the field, so you can start Rico Dowdle, but just lower your expectations to like a 10 or a 12-point game in fantasy football. All right, guys, those are all the matchups for this week. Do me a favor, hit that like button and show some love. Subscribe if you like the content. Last thing I'll say is if you have a tough start-sit decision this week and you want to ask me a question about it, check out the pinned comment. It's a direct link to our website where you can reach me at any time to ask a fantasy question. And while you're over there, if you don't have a free account just yet, use the promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, when signing up for a free account. If you do, use our promo code, then you'll get the My Team Analyzer, the Expert Consensus Rankings, and the Trade Calculator tools all for free. I appreciate you watching the video. I'll see you in the next one. Wide receivers should be out later in the day. All love. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.